Welcome to Access Spotlight. I'm Pam Parker, and I'm here with Dr. Columba Furio Spigner. She's the author of her recently published novel, Francesco's Song. She holds a doctorate from New York University, where she researched the cultural background of Italian immigrant women and their impact on the unionization movement in New York City's garment industry, and published several scholarly articles on this topic. She was an information technology professional on Wall Street for over 10 years, where she worked as a programmer, systems analyst, and project manager before making a transition into teaching. She was an educator with the New York City Department of Education and CUNY, and continues to teach part-time. An avid photographer and artist, she lives on Long Island with her husband Matthew and two sons, Michael and Frank. Based on wartime documents found in the author's family home, Francesco's Song is a moving portrayal of the struggles of the Italian people during the war years and the customs that bound them. It is the story of an immigrant who never lost love for his homeland and who valued family above all else. Welcome, Columba.
Hi, thank you, Pam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here. I just wanted to tell you that I really love this book.
You liked it, good.
It was started out as an assignment for me, and I actually just loved it and enjoyed it all the way through. To me, I felt like it was a love story where the history of Italy during the wartime years was weaved through.
Yes, yes.
Tell me about the inspiration in writing this book. I understand you were cleaning out your parents' home,
right,
and you found some boxes with documents and letters.
Right. Well, I grew up in Flushing, right near Casino Park, and we had a two-family house, and in time my father used the second-floor apartment as his study, and he kept all his books there, and he kept opera records, all kinds of papers, his personal collection of memorabilia, and he also had his jacket from World War II in a glass case.
Wow.
So as a little girl, I would, go up there. I mean, by the time we moved there, I wasn't so little anymore. But we knew this was his space. We sort of never really went up there to bother him. Mm-hmm. But when I had to sell the house, I had to go through all its papers, and so the problem was that my father kept everything. So I started to go through all his letters, bills that dated back years and years. So I had to throw everything out.
That's
but
such a big job.
It was a very big job, and it was a very heartbreaking job because these were all well, the whole house actually were all their furnishings, everything. So when I started to go through his papers, that's where I found folder after folder of these papers. To me, they look like, I don't know if you remember back in the day before computers when we met to make a copy of something.
Right.
What we did was we took a sheet of paper and then the carbon paper, and then there was a copy behind it. Of course. And that's how you made a copy.
Right.
Well, he had kept all the copies of documents that he had prepared while he was in the Italian Army during World War II. Wow. So they were all in folders. They were all I found my mother's notebooks from when she was in school, and I still remember a little box. It was a Hershey's chocolate box, and inside, now I knew these letters existed, I just had never bothered to open them up and read them. Right. But that day I opened them up and I started to read them, the ones that I could, because they were typed in Italian. The ones that were typed I could read. Okay. Because I could read Italian if it's typed and it's clear.
Right.
But there were other letters that were written in his handwriting, and those I couldn't read. So I put them aside, and the ones that I could read, they were very emotional for me because I started to see what life was really like for them. And of course, I knew about all the stories. They would tell us all the stories when we were little, right, about what it was like during the war. But when you're a little kid, you don't really pay too close attention to a lot of these
now
things.
You're looking at it through an adult's eyes.
Right.
And
right.
having that kind of empathy and compassion almost for your parents that you didn't have when you were younger.
Yes, yes. It was as if I was looking into a part of their life that I really didn't know about.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know anything about their life as young people that were in love and were separated because of the war. So now I had this opportunity, and for me, these documents were very important because originally my training is as a historian.
Right.
So when you're studying history academically, you are looking at primary sources, and these were all primary sources. So I had the letters, they were all personal letters. I had the wartime documents, and I had the notebooks. And so this is really where the inspiration, I had to write these things down. I had to sort of, once you write something down, it becomes concrete. And so that's where the inspiration came from.
Did you feel in that moment when you were reading these letters and these documents that I have to preserve this? Was it like an immediate thing?
Oh, absolutely, yes. In fact, I remember opening up all the letters and putting them, I got one of those big files, you know, where you can slip the papers in and with plastic covering them so that I could read them later on. And it was very frustrating for me because the ones that I could read, you know, those were really special, but I was dying to find out what was in the other letters. I wanted to be able to figure out what was going on. I don't know if you've ever seen letters from that time period, but the handwriting is very unique, and unless you are familiar with that kind of a handwriting, it's very hard to decipher. So after many years, I did find someone who was able to, from that time period, who was able to translate them for me. And I spent many hours in her kitchen. She would read the letters and translate them for me. I would record them on a tape recorder. Then I would go home and write them in English, type them up in English so that I could see. And what I saw was there started to be a pattern to the letters. And so that was only one part of the whole picture.
But that's very tedious work, and it sounds like it was years that you were compiling this information before you really sat down to write it.
I had started to write it down before I got to the letters, but certainly around the same time I started to, the reason I started to write them down was we grew up with so many stories. When I was little, my father and mother would tell us stories about the old country, what it was like to grow up in Italy. So there were so many stories, and in my mind I sort of had to dig around to remember the stories, the details of all these colorful, to me they just seem like such colorful characters. Almost like as if I was in a Fellini movie. I felt that way too reading it. I was so drawn to the people and their personalities that, I mean, it was a bonus to learn about, you know, wartime Italy, because that's not really a subject that's covered as much in school. They usually talk about England and France, and so to me it was very eye-opening. And the fact that you were able to write in such great detail about the time, the events and battles, how did you know that? Did you do I did a lot of research. There was a lot of research involved, but I couldn't classify it as a nonfiction book because there were just so many gaps in the story that I had to fill in the gaps with my own imagination based on the research. So for example, and then you start to ask yourself questions that you normally wouldn't think of asking. For example, once the war was over and my father was in Milan, how did he get back to Mola in the south? So you would think that, oh, just get on the train and go. But given the circumstances at the time, it was not conceivable that would have happened. It might have happened, but I didn't know. So I had to make up the story.
I see. I did like that part when he got on the train to finally get home. He scrapes up enough money to get a train ticket, and of course it's crazy crowded, and he thinks he's on his way, and the train stops because there's no more tracks.
There were no more tracks. The Germans blew up the tracks. As they retreated, they would blow up the tracks. And so it was very conceivable that he would have been stopped at that point. And so in the book, the train stops at Pesaro. And Pesaro was at the far, because when the Germans invaded Italy, they set up lines of reinforcements. There was in the north the Gothic line, and in the south the Gustav line, which ended started Casino, Monte Cassino, and ended in Pizarro. So it was very likely that that would be a good spot for the tracks to be blown up as they retreated.
Right, so it wasn't just haphazard. You picked it for a reason, knowing where the lines were.
Right.
Right. Well, I would love to backtrack and just start a little bit more towards the beginning.
Yeah.
I find it so fascinating because I know it's real and it's based on your parents, yet there are certain things which I didn't know as a reader. It did not stick out to me at all, you know, what you might have taken some license with. But I loved in the beginning when your parents were children, and their names are Francesco and Francesca. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right?
Right.
And that when they were little, it was like a chance meeting. He was on his bike riding down the cobblestone street, and he came upon your mom with her sisters playing with dolls, and they locked eyes. Now, did that really happen?
No. It might have, I don't know.
I love it. I'm a romantic. So.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, in such a small town, it's not unlikely that they would have met that way. But the meeting in the church that really did happen.
That did happen, and that was a little bit later. So they had that chance meeting. They were in church, in mass, and he can't stop looking at her. She senses it, but of course, in those times, you cannot, you know, you can't go up and talk to a boy, right? That was completely.
It was not a cool thing to do.
No.
For a lot of reasons. First, my grandfather was in the United States, so my grandmother was very protective of her daughters. This is my maternal grandmother. And so there were all kinds of restrictions as to where they could go, could not go, and certainly talking to a boy in the street, if anyone saw them right away, the mouths would have started gossiping about this and that. So the story was, as it was written in the book, that my mother avoided him by going out a different exit and followed her.
That's
and
right.
He followed her to see where she lived. So that's all true. That is all true.
Well, that's still pretty romantic, I would say.
Yeah, and we were told the story over and over. You know, my mother would start with the story, and then my mother would add to it, and then my father would go back, yes, but I came back to the house, and your mother shut the door in my face.
That's right. That's right. The way parents always tell stories, they add on top of each other. And I thought it was very fascinating that both of their fathers went to New York City.
Right.
To find work so that they could send money back home. So they both were being raised by single mothers, basically, for many years.
You know, it's interesting that when you start to write it down and you start to look at dates and you're putting two and two together, it's almost as if it's like a puzzle and you're putting all the pieces together and then you see the whole picture. Well, for example, as you said, both my grandfathers were in the United States, which was not unusual. A lot of men in those towns in southern Italy did that. They were called birds of passage. They came and went, and they were away for a period of time, made some money, sent it back, and then they would come back, sometimes just long enough to father another child, and then they would go right back. And so that was pretty typical. But what I didn't realize was that in my father's case, when he went to war, when he was commissioned to what would later become Yugoslavia in '41, my grandmother was really left with two small children because her husband was in the United States. Her other son, my father's younger brother, had just died.
Right, that's such a sad part.
It was really hard.
Yes, it really seemed hard. I mean, and then when he gets into the military police, you know, he had to apply for that, right? He applied to get in, and he got through, and it was a big accomplishment. And then he leaves to go to war, and he's not home. And he starts writing letters back home and to Francesca, who he has a crush on and is semi-engaged to.
Yeah, they were, for Italians, it's called promessi sposi, meaning they were promised to each other, which was pretty binding. I mean, they weren't formally engaged until later, but as far as they were concerned, they were engaged.
And the fact that he was writing the letters, and that was fine in the beginning, but once the war really got underway, there was no more communication. So I guess the point that I was going to make was that I felt so badly for his mother, your grandmother, who, had lost a son to illness, still raising young children, and now her other son she has no communication with. She doesn't know whether he's alive or dead. That's hard. But I wanted to go back one more time about when they were children. what I really found fascinating, even though it's mostly about your dad, Francesco, Francesca was such a good student. She was like a motivated little girl, and she wanted to go to secondary school. And her mother wouldn't allow her to do it because of what we had talked about, the customs that girls really shouldn't be traveling on their own and how that would look. But I thought about that and I said, I wonder if that has something to do with how wonderfully educated you are. Here was your mother who wanted an education so badly, and she wasn't able to do that. And you have your PhD. I mean, I think that's
yeah, that was
amazing.
one thing that my mother was. I mean, all of us were encouraged to go to school. There was no doubt about that. But in particular, with myself and my sister, no matter what happened, we were going to go to school, and what we wanted had nothing to do with it. We were going, and that was the end of it.
Isn't that so
and
interesting?
again, I remember she would say, "What I was not able to do, you're going to do."
That's right.
So that was absolutely.
So it's true. It really was. It
Yes.
really had an influence on how she mothered you.
Yes.
That's
Very much
amazing.
So. Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, the whole idea back then was that, well, in my mother's case, she would have to go to Bari. Now, if you look at the map, you see where Mola is. Mola is like going from Great Neck to Manhattan, maybe. Not any. It's not that far. It's maybe a 20-minute ride on the train. But the idea of a young girl getting on the train by herself and going into the large city, and her father is away in the United States, and no, that was not going to happen. My grandmother was very much. That's not to say that my family wasn't educated, because I remember my mother's aunt was a teacher. She was, in fact, she was a poet, and very well respected in town. So it always bothered me, why was it that my grandmother was so insistent that her daughters not go too far away? And I was never able to come up with a good explanation for that.
I think there's also a lot of pressure to find a husband and get that whole thing underway, and maybe that had something to do with it.
Yeah, perhaps. But as I say, I really don't know. I couldn't tell you why. She felt that way.
So they have this chance meeting, and they don't really get to speak to one another. And he wants to be able to. I guess the custom was his mother had to go to her mother and ask if they could actually see each other, right? Have a date or whatever it was.
They didn't really have dates the way we think of it. Their idea of a date was the whole family went out together and the two of them walked together. That was pretty much a date back then. But the mother had to speak for the son. And I remember my father used to say that he drove his mother crazy until finally she just relented. And
that's right. I love that.
Yeah, and also because he was going away to war, and in those days nobody knew what was going to happen, and so why leave something like that unsettled? God forbid anything happened, they couldn't live with themselves because they didn't let this thing happen. So so that's really the way it was. That part was not made up. You know, it's funny. You can talk to my brother and sister, and of course, they'll know right away what parts were made up and which parts were real.
Of course, because they were listening to all the old stories.
But even my uncle it was surprising when he read it. He said, "I didn't know, who are these friends of your father's? I don't remember who they were," because in the beginning of the book, he does have these friends that he hangs out with, Mario and Peppino and Nicola, and so my uncle, who are these? I thought,